Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. So, welcome and thanks for joining me. I'm Debra Richardson and Natai Barzam of nsKnox on today's webinar Controls for AP Vendor Master Teams to Prevent Fraud in the Vendor Master File. Now, some housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded. We will send you a link to the recording within 3 days. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. We will save them for the Q&A session during the last up to 15 minutes. If we don't get to all of your questions during the Q&A session, additional questions can be asked via email. And then don't forget to download the handouts. We do have a PDF of today's presentation and more information on my services and nsKnox products and services. So for those of you that have not attended one of my webinars before, I do want to introduce myself. I am Debra R. Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. And as a previous AP senior manager, managing a team of 17, processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month, as you can imagine, there were quite a few events where fraud was involved. And I worked with the payroll manager, since that was the other function where cyber criminals apply social engineering tactics, to implement over 70 internal controls and best practices to mitigate fraud. I now work with AP vendor teams that are still fully or partially manual to add authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices to eliminate fraud, regulatory fines, and bad vendor data. Always want to help accounts payable teams pay the right vendor. So I'll be your first speaker, and our second speaker will be Natai Barzam from nsKnox. So Natai, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Debra. So hi, everybody. My name is Natai Barzam, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for nsKnox, cyber fintech, and focused on B2B payment security. I have many years experience in cybersecurity and in enterprise software, and am working closely with finance professionals globally in securing their payments against cyber-enabled fraud. Very excited to be here with you and share some of the thoughts, experiences, and solutions that we offer.
All right, thanks, Natai. All right, so looking at the agenda, we will first take a look at both external and internal fraud and accounts payable. And then we'll talk about controls in the vendor process, vendor adds, vendor changes, and vendor record maintenance. And then I'll turn it over to Natai, who will talk about controls and continuous monitoring in vendor banking. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. So let's talk about fraud in accounts payable. So looking at the US first, this US map and the stats are taken from the FBI 2020 report of IC3 complaints. Now, total complaints for the year was over 800, or almost 800,000, up from 467,000 in 2019. So the average of 1,300 per day in 2019 jumped almost 50% to 2,200 per day in 2020. And business email compromise scams, where a fraudster attempts to trick AP team members into believing they are a CEO or a vendor, to add or change vendor bank details, that decreased in the number of incidents from almost 24,000 in 2019 to just over 19,000 in 2020. However, the cumulative amount increased from 1.7 billion in losses in 2019 to $1.8 billion in losses in 2020, giving an average loss of $92,000 per incident for 2020, which is up from just over 71,000 per incident in 2019. And this is a global issue. The FBI partners with the International Criminal Police Organization, or Interpol, and Interpol is an intergovernmental organization with 194 member countries. And in October 2019, they launched a public awareness campaign for business email compromise with the hashtag BEC Careful. Now, the FBI also reported in their 2020 IC3 report the top 20 international victim countries, with the UK being the largest at over 216,000 incidents. So the key here for global fraud is to be proactive in implementing authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices, because no AP vendor team member can be 100% all day, every day to spot these fraudulent emails, especially as many AP team members are still working from home, or maybe working in a hybrid scenario, or somehow still affected by the pandemic. And speaking of employees, whether they are working from home or not, internal fraud is also an issue. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, or ACFE, is a professional organization of fraud examiners, and they are the world's largest anti-fraud organization. Each year, they publish a report to the nations, which is a global study on occupational fraud and abuse. Now, according to the ACFE, organizations lose up to 5% annually from occupational or internal fraud. So who are these employees? They are employees that fit this fraud triangle. They have opportunity, which is access to system processes. They feel pressure, maybe personal financial pressure, such as a controller for a government, a city or a county. They have horses to feed, so that's actually a real scenario. There was a I believe she was a financial director. She had a bunch of horses. She stole millions of dollars over a 20-year period. And that's actually something that's on YouTube. It's called All the Queen's Horses. So they do have, that financial pressure. And then they also have rationalization. The company owes me. They didn't give me the raise I deserve, right? So all of these could have been really more widespread as many organizations implemented workarounds last year, and maybe continuing this year to get the work done, as they shifted the work abruptly last year, and again, maybe continuing some of those workarounds in 2021. Now, according to this infographic, team members that have been with the company for 6 years or more took twice as much. Male and older team members resulted in higher losses. 64% of all occupational fraudsters have a university degree or higher. The report to the nations also found that internal control weaknesses contribute to occupational fraud. So whether there's a lack of internal controls, or maybe no internal controls, or if you have internal controls, but there is an override of those existing internal controls, right? How often does that happen? And then maybe there is a lack of management review, and this could be needed where there is a segregation of duties issue and the management review is a compensating control, but maybe that doesn't happen, or it's just a cursory review. So we're going to go ahead and I will launch our first poll question now that we have talked all about internal and external fraud. So the first poll question is, how many suspicious, and I'm going to launch this. All right, so you should see it on your screen. How many suspicious communications have you experienced in 2021? More than 20, 10 to 20, 5 to 10, 1 to 4, or none. And I'll give about 20 more seconds for you to go ahead and answer that question, and then we'll take a look at the responses. All right, so about 10 more seconds. All right, it looks like we have over half that's voted, so I think we are good. I'm going to go ahead and close the polling, and then we'll take a look at the responses. So thanks everyone for voting. I'm going to go ahead and close. And now let's share that. Okay, so looking at the poll results, it looks like the majority, 41%, have had 1 to 4 this year. 21, or the next highest is 28% at 5 to 10, and then 21% of you have had more than 20. All right, and then 5% for both 10 to 20, and also 5% for none. Okay, so it looks like the majority are at 1 to 4, but we do have a high percentage that have more than 20. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the internal controls. The first set, which relate to new vendor ads. All right, so with new vendor ads, I'm going to start with the first obvious one, and that is avoiding duplicate vendors. Duplicate vendors can be an indicator of fraud, and they can result in duplicate payments. Now, in my experience with vendor master files, which is just a collection of vendor records, at any given time, there are at least 5% of duplicates. So now you may be thinking about your vendor master file and how many vendor records you have in there, the number of active vendors you have, and now you're wondering, how many duplicate or fraudulent payments are at risk of going out. Well, here's some things that you can do to avoid duplicate payments. So before you set them up, but after you do your 10 match to make sure the data is correct, you want to confirm that the vendor is not already in your ERP. So you want to search by vendor name, but you also want to search by vendor address and by tax ID. So even if the name does not match, they can still find the record. And make sure that everyone knows how to use those wildcards. This way, if someone added the in the body shop, but then someone else added a separate vendor record and just put them in as body shop, right, eliminating the, you can still find them. The next thing you want to do is make sure you're checking multiple vendor files. So for those that have multiple vendor master files, check each to verify the vendor data matches and you are really using the right system. Maybe a different system is the system that the vendor ultimately needs to be set up in, because sometimes those systems are based on different entities of your organization. So maybe they do belong in in a different system, but you can take that opportunity to review any other system that they may be in, so that you can update that vendor record as well. And then the last thing is to have one tax ID per vendor record. Now, I know this is harder with systems like SAP, but other accounting systems or ERPs, in those you can require one tax ID per vendor record, which will prevent the setup of duplicates. Now, some other internal controls and best practices. So you do want to require the email address. And why would you want that? Well, the same way that Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, your bank sends you a notification that your profile has been updated, you need to send that to your vendor. It can be the time saver for the vendor to come back and say, I didn't update it, so you don't make that, fraudulent payment, so it can prevent you from sending that fraudulent payment out in the first place. So that's one way you can use that email address. Or, you know, maybe you're implementing a new tool to automate your manual processes and you want to notify your vendors. So for each of these activities, you need an email address. And many of you may be requiring it now, but make sure you go back and clean your vendor master file and populate those missing email addresses. Now, the next control is to pay one-time vendors by your commercial card program, whether that's with a P card or with a virtual card. Now, not all vendors or payment types can be paid by your commercial card program, but where possible, you may even be able to avoid setting up a vendor record at all. And in addition to that, commercial card programs can carry increased fraud protection. Now, the next thing is to create vendor records for assigned or third-party payment providers. And I see this often, right? If you have a vendor that has been assigned, that has assigned their payments to a third party, set up that third-party vendor as a separate vendor record. Perform the validations you would normally perform for new vendor adds to make sure they are a real vendor. Obtain your authorization from your vendor, whether that's a contract, a judgment, and then set that third party up as a separate vendor and reroute or redirect payments from your original vendor to that third party vendor. So this saves you from that bad practice of putting another vendor's payment information on your original vendor's record in your vendor master file. And plus, if you go to do a bank account validation in the future, those are not going to match. And so that's just a bad practice. So make sure you have a separate vendor record for any of those third-party payments. The next thing is to separate customer and employee records from vendor records. So this is an internal, so this way an internal employee can unintentionally or intentionally select a customer or employee record for trades payable invoices or payments. And then the last one is to send a vendor welcome letter. Tell the vendor how to do business with you. Do you require a banking ACH form or a company branded ACH form? My recommendation is yes, but if you require that form for vendor bank changes, tell them that and tell them how to request one when a bank change is necessary. So that's new vendor adds. Let's now get into existing vendor changes. But before we do that, we do have another poll question. I'm going to go ahead and launch that one. And that poll question has to do with banking details. So what do you currently require before updating existing vendor bank details? And I think I have this set where you can select more than one, but go ahead and select between or multiple ones that you require. Bank details on bank or vendor letterhead, voided check, a phone call to the vendor, two or more of the above, or none of the above. All right, and I will give about 20 more seconds for you to go ahead and select which one or which ones, if I set that correctly, is more applicable for your company and your processes. All right, so it looks like we're getting, most have voted yet, so we'll do 10 more seconds. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and then let's look at the results. So I'm closing that, and then I'm going to go ahead and share. All right, so it looks like 51% are two or more of the above, which means you're doing the bank details or bank or vendor letterhead along with the voided check and or the phone call to the vendor. Now we had a tie at 41% of those that are doing bank details on bank or vendor letterhead, and then those that are doing the phone call to the vendor. And then the next highest was a voided check of 18%, and then 8% of you are doing none of the above. Okay, so let's get into existing vendor changes, which, as you can imagine, will include bank changes, since that's where we see quite a bit of fraud and we need controls around. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. All right, so let's get back into, let's look at, again, starting with vendor bank changes. So when accepting bank changes, bank details for change to an existing vendor record, you need to ensure that you are dealing with the right vendor. And I know that we are all used to making that call to confirm bank changes. I think the poll indicated 41% of you are doing that. But you may be able to stop fraud before making yet another call to your vendor. And to do that, you need to authenticate the requester and authenticate the data. So first, let's look at authenticating the requester. So the same way your bank authenticates you when you call in, you need to authenticate the requester that's sending that change. Ask them 2 to 3 questions that only the vendor would know, like the last 4 digits of the existing bank account and an invoice number, or maybe their remit address plus a PO number. And if you notice, I didn't ask for anything that is on the same document. So you don't want to ask for example, the invoice number and invoice date, since both of those can be found on an invoice. Now, once you have authenticated the requester, then you send them a company branded ACH form and require authenticating data on the form. So that can be the existing bank details, right? Because if they have new bank details, then they should have existing bank details. Or maybe you can ask for the last 3 payments, the deposit dates and amounts. You can also ask for the full tax ID, and that can help you out because you can make sure you're updating the correct vendor record in your vendor master file. And then optionally, I try to include also the remit address on the form. Again, that can help you out if you have a system like Oracle or PeopleSoft, where one vendor record can have multiple addresses or remit addresses. And then maybe even your vendor ID if your vendor would have that information. And then you can also include like any unique company element or unique company number that both you and your vendor would know. Now, the company branded ACH form, the best practices with that is, first, again, do not send it to your vendor until they have authenticated, and then change the form every year. And if you're only sending it to vendors that have authenticated, you're going to send them the most recent form. And that means that if you receive a form from a prior year or prior version, you know that's a red flag because you didn't just authenticate that vendor, you didn't just send them the most updated form. And then to take away the risk of them getting a copy of the form altogether, make sure you do not post it on your company website, again, because you only want to send it to those vendors that you authenticate. And then some other internal controls and best practices with existing vendor changes is the IRS 10 match when a vendor changes their legal name, and then make sure you update the vendor record. You do want to require a W-9 if the vendor changes their legal name. If they don't change their tax ID, you can keep the same vendor record and just update the vendor legal name. But the second one, if the vendor does change their tax ID, then you want to, again, make sure you do that IRS 10 match and create a new vendor record. So require a W-9 if the vendor changes their tax ID. If they do change their tax ID, right, that is a new reporting to the IRS, and thus you need a new vendor record to document and report the payment activity under that new tax ID. And then the last one is you definitely want to treat inactive vendors the same as new vendors. And so you want to collect the same documentation as a new vendor ad, because if that vendor is inactive, you will need to revalidate their information to make sure it is still good. Okay. All right, so now let's take a look at vendor record maintenance. So you've gotten the information in your vendor master file, but you do need to do some periodic review and some other controls. So let's take a look at those. So the first one, again, is the vendor master review. And really for all of these, you want to implement these preventative controls when the responsibilities of authorizing transactions, recording transactions, and maintaining custody of assets are not assigned to separate team members. So there's a separation or segregation of duties issue. For accounts payable, no one team member should be able to create a vendor record, post an invoice, and generate a payment. Now, the vendor master file review, you want to review all vendor ads and all changes made. You can also do a pay cycle review prior to releasing payments. And there you want to review the reports of the payments generated. I once had a client that would review invoices over a certain threshold that recently had a bank change. The next one is review invoices for existing vendors. So you want to ensure the invoice numbering is consistent with historical invoice numbers. Also, reviewing the backup for any non-PO invoices. So verify the invoice and the vendor are valid. And then lastly, continuous monitoring, right? There are some third-party providers that can provide continuous monitoring of vendor information, and nsKnox will talk about how they can do this for your vendor banking. Okay. And then other internal controls and best practices, so least privileged access to vendor records in your accounting system or ERP, right? Make sure that you only give access to those that absolutely need it, and make sure you're doing regular security roles and access audits to ensure that those that have left the company or maybe transferred to a different department, that their access has been removed. The next one is to mask sensitive personal information on the vendor record. Only the vendor team that has access to add and edit vendor records, they really are the only ones that need access to the full tax IDs or banking information in your accounting system or ERPs. I mean, AP can post invoices to the right remit with just the last 4 digits of the bank account number. They can also verify they have the right vendor by looking at the last 4 or 5 digits of the vendor's tax ID. The next one is an audit log of the accounting system ERP and the audit of the vendor processes. So make sure you keep an audit log and perform an audit at the vendor process level. This will ensure that all processes you are putting into place will be followed by the vendor team members. Also, with audit logs in place, management can look for changes in banking or remit addresses that were changed and then changed back quickly, which can be a big red flag for occupational fraud. And then vendor master file cleanup. Make sure you do it on a consistent basis, right? So inactivating vendors you haven't done business with in 15, 18, or 24 months. Then you check for duplicate vendor records, and then you revalidate all of your active vendors to make sure they don't have any changes, making sure they haven't been added to a watch list since you originally set them up or modified them last. And do that again on a recurring basis basis, either monthly, quarterly, annually, or at the very least annually. And then lastly, you can check vendor addresses and bank addresses against employee records. Now, this can avoid or will avoid internal fraud, and it doesn't mean that someone has to gain access to employee payroll records. This comparison or monitoring can take place in the background. Work with your IT team, and then have management notified only if there is ever a match. Okay. So that is what I had for internal controls, best practices in the new vendor ads process, in the existing vendor change process, and also in the vendor record maintenance process. And at this time, I am going to turn it over to Natai so that he can tell us all about nsKnox. And Natai, I will be sending that over to you. Okay.
Thanks, Debra. And hopefully everybody can see my screen now. Debra, can you see this?
Yes, I can see it.
All right, thank you. So hi again, everyone. Debra shared with us some great insights around the problem of payment fraud, mentioned risks of business email compromise and internal fraud, and also shared some great best practices. And so I'm going to try and follow and share with you a bit about how the use of technology to prevent payment fraud can actually help you automate some of the best practices discussed and then increase efficiencies while you're reducing the risk. Let's first look at the problem, though. For some finance professionals that I speak with, payment fraud actually equals social engineering, and prevention for many means just account validation. How do I verify account ownership when I get these details, either when I onboard new suppliers or when I get the update requests? Well, Debra discussed internal fraud as well, so I think by now everybody understands that the problem is much bigger. And in fact, the problem is that outsiders and insiders will continue to try and oftentimes succeed at substituting fraudulent banking details throughout the funds transfer journey, so throughout your procure-to-pay process. And while your specific processes may vary, the flow that is on the slide is pretty typical. You do have a process to onboard new vendors, and you do hopefully have a process to update banking details when requests arrive. When you do that, you enter data in your system, in your vendor master file, and it now becomes data at rest. And finally, when you get these invoices, you group them, process them, approve them into payment proposals and payment runs, and turn them into payment transactions, which go out to the bank or the clearinghouse. Now, when we discuss social engineering, and Debra mentioned how this problem is growing, I will just mention that it's also becoming more sophisticated in approach. It's no longer just email-based. Nowadays, fraudsters are actually also using phone hijacking, phone spoofing, and even techniques such as voice cloning. So you get a phone call, it looks like your boss, it's from his cell phone number, it sounds like the boss, and you're getting instructions, it turns out it's a fraudster. Now, social engineering is really targeted at manipulating or using your people to enter the wrong data into the system, to trick them into doing this. But it doesn't stop there, right? Well, we discussed the bad insider problem deeply. Debra did. PwC concurs, indicating around half of the economic crimes are actually committed by internal actors. And that's pretty mind-boggling, because internal actors, they know the processes the best, they know the controls and how to bypass them and how to cover their tracks. And they can actually impact banking details throughout the journey. You may get the right details and they can manipulate them when they enter them into the system. Data at rest can be manipulated by bad insiders, sometimes working together to bypass controls. Your IT folks, unfortunately, can gain access to the underlying master data and so on. It can also impact data in payment files before you send them. And lastly, there's the consideration for cyber attacks. Outsiders and fraudsters can actually steal your credentials, use them on your behalf to manipulate data, or develop specialized malware, malicious software that's going to update details in your ERP system. And so while a lot of focus is put and emphasis is put on account validation, we should also ensure continuous validation that actually monitors the data throughout the journey when it's at risk and when it's actually being used. And why am I excited about all this? This is because I come from nsKnox, and for nsKnox, fighting payment fraud is our mission in life. We are a cyber fintech company, and we were founded by the gentleman you see in front of you. He's well known in the cyber space as the founder, ex-chairman, and CEO of CyberArk, and our company really combines cybersecurity know-how with payment processing know-how. Some of our partners include Microsoft as a coastal partner and KPMG, with whom we're partnering and are serving some customers. And obviously, given the problem is industry agnostic and everybody hurts, you'll see amongst our customers, organizations from all types and all kinds, typically very large, operating globally, cross-border payments, sourcing is typically subject to more fraud. In fact, anyone that's receiving or making electronic payments should use a solution like nsKnox. And given that fraud can actually happen to yourselves, your organization, any of your suppliers, any of your customers could fall victim to payment fraud, nsKnox provides a holistic end-to-end solution that covers both incoming and outgoing payments. So incoming to ensure that when your customers and business partners pay you, you actually get the money and they don't pay a fraudster and avoid these cash flow damages and so on. And outgoing payments, obviously, to ensure that at the end of the day, when you actually effect payments, they go to the right account. Now, one of the building blocks of our solution is the ability to validate bank account ownership globally. So any account anywhere can be validated. And any bank account owner can actually generate an nsKnox bank account certificate that confirms that they're the owner. Now, having this would be great, as it can replace the manual processes that we discussed earlier. The requests for documentation that I think it was 41% of you are making, the phone calls that yet again 41% of you are making could be replaced. And not only do we get rid of that, we could also make it much more secure. So what is this nsKnox bank account certificate? Well, on the right-hand side, you can see it, and I'll show it in the demo even larger than that, but it looks like an innocent PDF, but in fact, it's a much smarter and secure document. As you can see, the document contains details of the account owner and the bank account itself, and the details include the owner's official name, the address, the country. It includes the entity ID, such as a tax ID or a DUNS number, and it includes bank account country and details. But you'll notice that some of these details are masked. And this is because instead of sending these details out in the open, the bank account certificate document actually contains a hidden encrypted certificate within the document that contains the complete details themselves. And then anyone that receives this type certificate can actually view the certificate and view the complete details and validate and verify that they are indeed correct pretty easily, simply by dragging and dropping the certificate on our secured portal. Let me show you how this actually looks like. So first, if we look at the complete certificate, you can see Acme Inc., their address is right here, all the payee details and all the banking details are right in front of you. As importantly is, if I'm just going to get one of these files, get in the interface and drag and drop one of those certificate files, we can see that you can really quickly, I'm just dragging and now I'm going to drop the document here, and when I hit verify certificate, It's going to decrypt the data hidden within this document. It's going to connect with our secured servers and come back with a result saying, hey, this is a validated certificate. And we can see the complete and full details of Acme Inc., including their tax ID and DUNS number, including the complete routing and account numbers and SWIFT codes. Now, obviously, if the wrong details are provided, then it will come red and an error message will show. Now, because the certificate is verifiable, it's encrypted and signed, it cannot be manipulated. And this provides a really nice and secure way to share banking details, to protect them from manipulation, and to view and verify them. And you could actually use these certificates to protect both the paying and the receiving entities. You can share your bank account certificates with your customers and business partners to secure your incoming payments. And you could also ask your vendors and service providers for theirs and continuously verify these to secure outgoing payments. Now, our focus today is on AP and outgoing payments, so let's focus on that and dive into Payment nsKnox for AP. So another building block of the Payment nsKnox solution is a secured external layer, which we call cooperative cybersecurity. This one is used to store sensitive data, payment data, and everything that nsKnox does, and it serves as an external security layer on top of yours. And what this means is that anybody trying to manipulate data would need to not only manipulate your systems, but actually manipulate data in this external system. And if we go back to the internal fraud issue, and your people may have access to your system and your controls, but they'll find it much harder to access this type system. On top of that, there are 3 functional modules. The first one provides for the account validation, and it does that for both domestic accounts and international accounts, any account anywhere, and we'll talk a bit more about this. This takes care of the input to the system. So whenever you onboard a new supplier or when you get these requests to modify details, you have the way to ensure that the data is indeed valid before you enter it into the system. Now, when data is in your systems and it becomes data at rest, you could use the master data guard to protect your master data and continuously validate it. And we'll expand on this a bit in a second. And lastly, as a final gate, you also have a payment transaction verification module, which allows you to scan payment files and payment transactions before you send them to the bank, and sometimes after you send them as reconciliation, but before you confirm them, so you make sure you only pay valid accounts. And all this could be accessed either through the Payment nsKnox portal. This means it requires no integration at all. Everything can be done on demand. And you could actually start using all this tomorrow. We also offer file-based automation, which allows you to automate some of the activities such as master data, scan and security, or payment file scanning. And we also offer a complete set of REST APIs that can integrate with any ERP system. Let's dive a bit into the different components. So for account validation in the bank account certificate, it is global. This means that you could validate or have your suppliers validate any account anywhere. If any of your vendors do not have a bank account certificate, they can easily get one. And getting a bank account certificate is a one-time simple process, which I'll demonstrate. Once they went through that process, our technology kicks in, and based on accurate and reliable third-party data, primarily from the banking system, cross-referenced with other databases such as legal entity databases and so on and so forth, different databases in different countries, our technology will verify the ownership of the bank account using details such as entity ID, the official name, the business address, the country they operate in, their banking details, where it is, and the positive confirmation that they can actually own this. Now, instead of asking the interested party to confirm the details, where you have to verify and authenticate their identity as well as the details, we actually don't ask them. We get this information from trusted and reliable third-party sources, which is more secure. Once details are verified and a certificate is issued, as we've discussed, it's a verifiable, encrypted, and signed certificate, which allows you to feel comfortable with the details and allows you to continuously verify that the details are correct and stay correct throughout the journey. Next is master data card. This one will continuously verify the integrity of your master data. It can compare the current status of your master data with the past status of it to identify any changes to master data, and more importantly, to cross-reference this with their validation status, so that not only do you know that things have changed, but you also know if the things that are in there were verified either by using the nsKnox services or by using your own processes. And what this does is it also ensures compliance with your own validation processes. And it also identifies missing or invalid data. So when scanning your master data, it will identify account numbers that are partial, maybe missing routing details or sort code, partial SWIFT details, or invalid IBAN numbers in your database. And of course, also invalid bank accounts, ones that were not validated. And in fact, what this allows you to do is to automate the audit process of your entire master data. So instead of having to selectively try and look at some vendors and where they validated correctly, do they contain all the details, you can actually automate all that. And we'll see this in a demo in a few seconds. And finally, the payment checks. This allows you to automatically scan payment files and transactions, and it will identify exceptions to your validation policy and your payment thresholds. And ultimately, it will prevent unauthorized payments. So with that background, let me turn to the live system and show you a quick demo of how this looks using the portal. And as said, everything that I'll demonstrate now can actually be automated either by file-based automation or through ERP APIs. Now, the first thing that we typically do with customers is a process we call baselining. This means that we will baseline your existing master data, your vendor master file within our system. And from that moment on, we will also provide another external control layer on top of that. And every time you synchronize your master data again, we'll produce these change logs, and we'll be able to identify if anything within your database is valid or not valid. There's an easy way to filter and just quickly see what in my master data is not validated. And when you apply this, it will show you entries that were not validated, not by your process, and not using the nsKnox service. In case you want to validate yourselves, you could do that by initiating what we call a self-validation. This, for example, means you've received the documentation you've asked for and you've conducted the phone call. So you could say, we verified this by making the phone call, the unsolicited one, hopefully, and then document the process. Who did you talk to? What was the phone number? When did this happen? What was the description or any notes from that call? Any documentation that you want to apply, the bank or vendor letterhead, and so on. And when you hit self-validate, it will mark this as valid for your organization only. No one else will know about this. Now, this may not give you additional details when you're validating accounts, but simply by making sure that you follow your own process and the ability to audit it at any time, you've increased the security level significantly. Now, if this may be okay for certain vendors, for the ones that you're paying large amounts of money on a regular basis, you definitely want to have something stronger. And this is where you want to ask them to get a bank account certificate, because then you'll know for sure they're the owner of that bank account. If they have one, great, you could verify it like we've demonstrated before. If not, you can ask them to create one, which is really, really easy. All they need to do is get on an nsKnox account validation website and follow instructions for a one-time process pretty simple. This website is multilingual, so regardless of where your suppliers may be around the world, they can choose the language at which they want to see instructions, frequently asked questions and answers. And when they hit get started, they'll follow the steps. And let's say you're now asking the new Alpha Records to go ahead and create this bank account certificate and register. First step is registration. They enter their company details, just like you typically want to ask them and know. They may enter some contact details of a contact person. And finally, and most importantly, the banking details that they claim to be correct. They want to be paid into this. Now, anybody can enter any type details. It doesn't mean they're correct. And therefore, when they hit register, an engine behind the scenes is going to analyze the data. And based on where they are in the world, and based on the fact that they may have been validated already, they have a certificate or not, will provide instructions. As an example, if they're in the US, then instructions may be that nsKnox is going to transfer a random amount into their account, and they're simply asked to return this amount in using ACH into the nsKnox validation account. Here, the details at the bottom. When they do this, the nsKnox technology kicks in, account details are verified, kind of like a glimpse into the know your customer data that their bank has on them. And it doesn't matter if it's a major bank or a regional one, it will get verified. If they were in Europe, then they would have been asked to transfer €1 over SEPA to a validation account in the UK, in London. And again, the same technology would kick in and validate the details and provide them with a certificate that they can share with you. Once they've shared the certificate, you can either upload the certificate as I've demonstrated before, or you could actually type in details that were provided to you in one of the old-fashioned ways. So you can search by name or by ID. We actually recommend to do this using ID. And then you could either use an international SWIFT or IBAN, or a domestic bank account if they're in the US. So just type in the routing number and the account number. And once you've done this, you'll see that the account was actually validated, standard validated. This means that the details, their official name, the country in which they operate, their IDs like a DUNS number and tax ID, their official address were all verified, and they're the positive owner of this Bank of America in the US account with these details. Now you could save it in your systems knowing the details are correct. But again, we want to make sure that nobody manipulates the data, either internal actors, outsiders, or malicious software, which is why you can now periodically synchronize your master data and check all of it at once, audit it. So you could just upload a file. And for example, you can now, I'll just go ahead and select a copy of a master, fresh copy of a master data file. And it will get processed and compared to all the versions of the master data that you've synchronized in the past. And when you're going to review the report, this actually provides you with an automatic change log. And in this example, it lets you know that you've added a new bank account for a company called Feroli with these IDs, the internal ID in your system, the Knox ID, the country, and here's the bank account at HSBC. And you'll notice that the system lets you know that this was standard validated, i.e. it had a certificate, and you can see all the details of the certificate. If any anomalies are identified, then you'll know about it, like Viva la Repubblica here in France with this IBAN, and you're seeing it's not validated. Now this is really important because by doing this periodically into your entire master vendor file, you can identify anomalies ahead of time. And you do not want to identify these during the payment cycle when everybody is stressed out and time is of the essence. So identifying early is extremely important. Now, if we did mention payment cycles and payment date, you're also able to scan payment files. Again, I'm showing you the portal version of this, but you could always automate this through file-based automations or API, which is pretty straightforward. And when you load a file to scan this, the system will go ahead, scan all your payment transactions, look at the account numbers you're using, look at the amounts you're paying, cross-reference this with the certificates and database that's available, and with your policy, and will provide you with any alerts. As you can see in this example, 2 alerts. The first one says the payment's rejected because the account was not in your master vendor file. Well, you shouldn't have any of these, and this is something you definitely want to investigate. And the second error here is the payment's rejected because the account was not validated at a sufficient level. The policy here stated I'm okay paying even accounts that were not validated up to $1,000. I'm okay with self-validation if it's up to 10K. Above this, I need the stronger standard validation certificate. Somebody's trying to pay $1,600 and the account's not validated, and therefore it is flagged. So hopefully this was a quick demonstration of how the system works, which concludes my part of the presentation. And let me hand it over to you, back to you, Debra.
All right. Thanks a lot, Natai. It was great to see. I know I provided quite a few manual controls, but it was great to see how the controls around banking and your vendor's banking information can be automated. And love the fact that you can do both domestic and international. You can verify globally your vendor's bank account information, and then also love that bank account certificate. So great demo. All right, and that will bring us to our third poll. And so let me go ahead and get that launched. All right, so now that you've heard about different controls to protect the vendor master file from fraud, and you've seen the great demo on automating the bank account validation process, you may be thinking about the vendor data in your vendor master file. So question, how often do you review changes and verify the integrity of your entire vendor master file? Options are at least once a month, once a quarter, once a year. We only audit randomly selected vendors. And then the last one, we do not have a process to periodically review vendor master data changes. So go ahead, I'll give about 20 more seconds for everyone to vote. All right, about 10 more seconds to go. And if you remember, I stated at some point in the presentation that I do recommend once a month, but I know in most cases it's a manual process, so quarterly, annually, at the very least annually is recommended. So about 5 more seconds for everyone to vote. Looks like we've got well over half. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that, and let me share the results. Okay, so as we can see, we had 44% do not have a process to periodically review the vendor master data. Wow, so that is something that hopefully you will look at, especially as you have an option now to review the vendor banking using the tool from nsKnox, which can automate that process. Then we had kind of a three-way tie between at least once a month, once a year, and then we only audit randomly selected vendors, and then we had 11% that do that review once a quarter. So thanks everyone for participating in that, and then let me go back here. All right, and so now we're going to get to the Q&A. I know we only have a couple of minutes available. We'll get through as many as we can. If your question is not answered and you did add it in the question section, we will go ahead and answer that for you via email. Or you can also, if you think of a question afterwards, reach out to myself or Natai at the email addresses that are on the screen. Okay, so it looks like we may have time for one. And the question is, and this is for you, Natai, is nsKnox different software, or can I use the service on existing software? Our company uses Microsoft 365.
So our solution can work with any ERP system you may be using today, and you could actually use it without integrating using our portal to start with, and over time automate and integrate with your system, Microsoft, SAP, Oracle, others.
Okay. All right, so again, that is all the time that we have. We will answer any of the questions that came in during the presentation via email. And again, if you think of any questions after this presentation, feel free to send your email to either myself or Natai using the email addresses on the screen. So I do want to thank everyone for attending. This webinar is now concluded. Thanks, everyone.